the crossroads of civilization. Between two great cradles of civilization stretched a narrow strip of land, fragile, yet destined for a monumental role in human history. To the west lay Egypt, with its eternal Nile and monuments that touched the sky. To the east, Mesopotamia, where the twin rivers carried the weight of empires. And between them, like a seam, stitching continents together, was Canaan. You stand at this crossroads, a corridor of stone and soil, where Africa, Asia, and Europe converge. The land itself is a paradox. Along the Mediterranean coast, fertile plains invite farmers and invaders alike, their fields glowing with golden wheat and vineyards heavy with fruit. Yet only a short distance inland limestone hills rise in jagged ridges, terraces cut into their flanks where olive trees cling stubbornly to life. To the north towers Mount Hermon, its peak crowned with snow, even in the heat of summer, feeding streams that nourish the valleys below. Southward, the Jordan River carves a deep scar through the earth, a corridor of water leading from the cool waters of Galilee to the lifeless salt of the Dead Sea. And further still stretches the Negev, a wilderness where shifting sands whisper the secrets of Sinai. This geography shaped destiny. To travel from Egypt to Mesopotamia, armies marched through Canaan. Merchants carrying cedar wood, copper, and purple dye traversed its roads. Pilgrims, envoys, and refugees alike passed its borders. Canaan was never a remote outpost. It was the hinge upon which the doors of empire swung open and shut. Every power that rose around it desired to control it, and every people who settled within it felt the pressure of history's hand. The Egyptians knew this land as retinue, a vital buffer protecting their empire. To the Mesopotamians it was Amuru, a frontier against Western tribes and a gateway to the sea. But eventually the people who lived here gave it a name that endured: Canaan. They were seafarers and traders, masters of purple dye that stained the robes of kings, and they carried their goods across the wine-dark waters of the Mediterranean. Their name, etched into clay tablets and carved in stone inscriptions, outlasted the rise and fall of countless armies. Yet geography was more than backdrop, it was adversary and ally. The mountains sheltered small communities from conquest, while the plains left them exposed to the thunder of chariots. The river valleys drew life, but they also served as highways for invasion. To live in Canaan was to live at the edge of opportunity and danger, blessed with abundance, but never free from fear. Even in its earliest ages, this land bore witness to the ceaseless rhythm of human movement. Caravans creaked across dusty tracks laden with copper from Cyprus, ivory from Africa, and spices from Arabia. Languages mingled in the marketplaces, words from distant lands colliding into new dialects. Soldiers from empires far away pressed their footprints into its soil, leaving behind broken weapons and burned towns as testimony to their passage. This corridor was no empty wilderness waiting to be claimed. It was already alive, a patchwork of cultures and peoples woven together by geography and necessity. And because of this, Canaan would become more than a piece of land. It would become a crucible where ideas clashed, merged, and transformed, a stage upon which faith, identity, and destiny would be forged, watched over by the indifferent peaks and valleys that shaped them all. The first cities of stone and clay. Long before kings and temples rose in splendor, the people of Canaan were already laying the foundations of urban life. From scattered villages nestled in valleys came the spark of transformation, the birth of true cities. The early Bronze Age was a time of walls and workshops of innovation and ambition when human communities pushed beyond mere survival to create societies of permanence and power. Picture Jericho, one of the oldest and most enduring settlements on Earth. By 3000 BC, it was more than a cluster of huts, it was a fortress. Massive stone walls, some over 10 meters thick, encircled the settlement, enclosing homes, granaries, and workshops. The walls themselves were more than defense, they were symbols, tangible statements of human will against chaos, proof that people here intended not merely to exist, but to endure. Within those walls, perhaps 3,000 inhabitants worked and prayed, each one part of a growing fabric of civilization. Other cities soon followed. At Ai, fortifications rose built with care and determination, protecting markets where goods from across the region were exchanged. Within these early urban centers, narrow lanes wound between tightly packed houses, smoke curling from hearths, the scent of baking bread mixing with the tang of smelted copper. Every sound echoed with ambition, potters' wheels spinning rapidly, metal workers hammering ore into tools, women weaving textiles destined for trade. These were not static villages, they were engines of culture humming with life and energy. Craft specialization blossomed in this new environment. The potter no longer needed to farm, the smith no longer needed to herd. Farmers brought grain, vintners delivered wine, herders provided wool, and each contributed to the flourishing of the whole. Hierarchies emerged, leaders who managed storage, priests who oversaw rituals, and artisans whose skills became indispensable. The seed of social stratification took root, dividing lives between laborers, elites, and those who communed with the gods. Technology hastened the change. Stone tools gave way to copper blades, then to bronze and alloy that hardened plowshares and sharpened swords, shifting the balance of survival. A farmer with bronze could till deeper, harvest more, and defend his land with newfound strength. With every innovation, life in Canaan cities grew both richer and more perilous, for wealth always invited envy. Trade carried this wealth outward. Canaan was not isolated. It was linked to the broader Bronze Age world. Ships from Cyprus delivered copper, Egyptian caravans brought gold, and Mesopotamian merchants carried fine textiles in exchange for oil and wine. The exchange was not merely material, it was cultural. From every transaction came new words, new gods, new techniques. The cities of Canaan were crossroads in miniature, where a pot might bear a Mesopotamian design and a ritual might echo Egyptian prayers. And yet the very walls that proclaimed safety also revealed the dangers these people faced. Why build such formidable defenses if not to ward off invaders? Competition between cities was fierce, and raiding was a constant threat. Power shifted rapidly. A settlement could rise to prominence only to be reduced to rubble within a generation. Still, each rebuilding reinforced resilience, embedding within the land a memory of persistence that would echo through centuries. For the first time, humanity in this region was organizing life on a scale beyond kinship. The city was more than houses gathered together. It was an idea, a structure of society where strangers could live side by side under shared laws and common defense. In Canaan, that idea found fertile ground, growing in complexity until it shaped the destiny of all who dwelled there. The stones of those first walls still whisper their story. They tell of ambition and fear, of markets buzzing with trade, of temples filled with incense, and of a people who discovered that by building together they could carve permanence into the shifting sands of history. These were the first cities of stone and clay, the foundations upon which the drama of Canaan would forever stand. Trade routes and purple dye. As Canaan's cities grew, their walls did not confine them. Instead, they became launching points for exchange, their gates opening onto a vast network of trade routes that carried goods and ideas across the ancient world. Here, merchants became as important as kings, for it was commerce that tied this small strip of land to the fates of empires. Picture the coastal plain where caravans moved slowly under the sun, their camels laden with goods from distant lands. From Egypt came gold papyrus and exotic perfumes. From Mesopotamia came fine textiles, carved ivory, and precious stones. From Arabia and beyond came incense and spices, wafting their fragrance along the highways of trade. In return, Canaan offered wine pressed from terraced hills, oil from endless groves of olives, and cedar wood cut from northern forests, so prized that Egyptian pharaohs recorded their import on temple walls. But nothing spoke more clearly of Canaan's wealth than the purple dye of the Phoenician coast. Extracted painstakingly from the murex snail, drop by drop, this dye was so rare that only kings and priests could afford to wear it. It became a symbol of authority, a color of divine right and imperial majesty. The Canaanites skilled in seafaring carried this treasure across the Mediterranean, their ships carving paths through the wine-dark sea, sails taut against the western wind. They traded not just with Egypt and Mesopotamia, but with Cyprus, Anatolia, even far-off Aegean islands. Their harbours at Byblos, Tyre and Sidon grew into bustling hubs where the world's languages mixed in a chorus of bargaining voices. Trade, however, was never just about goods. Along with amphorae of oil and jars of grain came songs, myths, and gods. A scarab amulet from Egypt might pass into Canaanite hands, while Mesopotamian cuneiform tablets carried stories of Gilgamesh that echoed across cultures. From every exchange came not only wealth, but transformation as foreign ideas were adopted, reshaped, and made local. The very identity of Canaan was molded by this ceaseless flow, making its people both unique and cosmopolitan. The highways themselves were arteries of civilization. The Way of the Sea. The coastal road carried armies and merchants alike from the Nile Delta to the Euphrates. The King's Highway, running along the Transjordan Plateau, connected caravan routes from Arabia to Damascus. These were not empty roads, but lifelines pulsing with the steady rhythm of hooves and wheels, where every traveller brought both opportunity and danger. Yet wealth carried risks. Prosperous cities attracted the gaze of empires. Egypt looked north to secure its grain supply, while Mesopotamian kings eyed the sea they could not easily reach. For the Canaanites, prosperity was never without peril. Each shipment of timber or dye was shadowed by the threat of tribute demands, raids, or outright conquest. Still the merchants persisted. By their efforts, a humble village could become a city, and a coastal settlement could transform into a kingdom. In their ledgers and ship manifests lay the first signs of globalization, ancient though it was. Canaan became a bridge not only of land but of culture, its markets humming with goods that bore the scent of distant shores. And so as amphorae clinked in storerooms and caravans creaked across stony roads, Canaan's destiny was shaped as much by merchants as by warriors. The purple dye they carried became a symbol that outlasted empires, reminding the world that from this narrow corridor flowed treasures that clothed king-sustained armies and colored history itself. Gods of fertility and storms. In Canaan, the stones of the earth and the cycles of the sky were more than natural forces, they were divine. Life depended on the rains that swept in from the sea, on the fertility of the soil, on the mysterious pulse of human birth and renewal. To survive, the people turned to gods who embodied these rhythms, shaping a pantheon as vibrant and complex as the land itself. Foremost among them was Baal, the storm god, whose voice was the thunder and whose weapon was the lightning bolt. When the skies opened with rain, it was Baal who gave his blessing. Without him the land withered, harvests failed, and famine threatened. To the Canaanite farmer looking anxiously at his parched field, Baal's power was not distant. It was immediate, a matter of life or death. Beside him stood Asherah, the mother goddess symbol of the earth's womb. She was carved in terracotta figurines, her image clasping her breasts, a sign of nurturing abundance. Her worship was not confined to temples, but woven into households where small shrines honored her protective role over families and fertility. There was also Astarte, fierce and alluring, associated with love, war, and the renewal of life. Her cult carried echoes of Mesopotamian Ishtar, showing how Canaan's gods absorbed and reshaped foreign influences. To her devotees, she embodied passion and danger, the dual forces of creation and destruction. Worship unfolded on high places, hilltops cleared for altars open to the sky. Fires crackled, smoke rose, and offerings of grain, wine, and animals were laid before the divine. In some places, standing stones marked sacred ground, their silent presence a reminder of gods who demanded both reverence and sacrifice. Rituals could be both communal and intimate, festivals of abundance that filled the hills with song or whispered prayers offered in secret by parents desperate for a child. These practices shocked outsiders. Later, Israelite writers condemned them, especially the rituals they believed involved sacred prostitution or even human sacrifice. Whether such accusations were exaggerations or reflections of real practices remains debated, but what is clear is that the Canaanite religious world was charged with intensity, its boundaries between sacred and everyday life blurred. The gods themselves lived stories. In Canaanite myth, Baal waged war against Mot, the god of death and drought. Their struggle was eternal. When Baal triumphed, rains came and fields flourished. When Mot prevailed, the earth turned to dust. This cycle mirrored the seasons, embedding cosmic drama into the lives of farmers who waited anxiously for clouds to gather. What made Canaan's religion distinctive was its openness. Egyptian gods entered their pantheon. Mesopotamian deities left their marks. Rather than a rigid system, it was a fluid tapestry, constantly rewoven as new influences arrived through trade and conquest. In this way, Canaanite worship reflected the land's identity as a crossroads, absorbing, adapting, and reimagining the divine. And yet within this swirl of fertility cults and storm deities, something new was quietly taking shape. In the hills, among shepherds and farmers, voices began to speak of a god, unlike the others, a god of covenant and command, who would not be represented by image or idol. That story was still in its infancy, but already the old gods of fertility and storms were sharing their stage with an emerging faith that would one day transform the world. The Age of Collapse. The Bronze Age had brought centuries of flourishing cities, far-reaching trade networks, and the rule of mighty empires. Yet around 1200 BC, this glittering world cracked apart with startling speed. From Anatolia to the Levant, from the Aegean to the Nile kingdoms that had seemed eternal, collapsed almost overnight. Canaan, poised at the heart of these rivalries, was caught in the storm. The Hittite Empire in Anatolia, long a rival to Egypt, fell suddenly. Its capital Hattusa burned and was abandoned, leaving behind silent ruins where scribes once recorded treaties and kings once ruled vast armies. Egypt, too, reeled. Its pharaohs could no longer sustain distant garrisons. The once iron grip of the Nile dynasty slackened, its armies retreating southward, its monuments silent witnesses to waning power. The causes of this collapse were many, tangled like roots of an ancient tree. Some point to the sea peoples, mysterious raiders who swept across the Mediterranean, burning cities, toppling thrones and leaving terror in their wake. Others speak of droughts that withered crops for decades, of famines that drove desperate migrations, of earthquakes that shook fortresses to rubble. Perhaps it was all these forces together, human, natural, and divine, that shattered the old order. In Canaan, the effect was profound. Cities that had thrived for centuries fell into ruin. Fortified walls cracked, trade routes grew silent, and palaces were abandoned to weeds and dust. Without the protection of Egypt or the Hittites, local rulers were left exposed, their wealth inviting attack. In some sites, destruction layers reveal fire and violence. In others, abandonment tells a quieter story of populations simply walking away. Amid this chaos, new groups emerged. The Philistines, perhaps among the sea peoples themselves, settled along the coastal plains, building their strongholds with iron weaponry that gave them fearsome advantage. Inland in the hills, small farming villages multiplied their people, carving a life from the rocky soil. These were the ancestors of the Israelites, communities bound more by kinship and shared survival than by any centralized rule. The contrast was striking. Where once stood grand cities with temples and palaces, now small hamlets dotted the highlands. Storage jars replaced monumental granaries. Family compounds replaced sprawling markets. It was as if society had contracted, shrinking back to its essentials, preparing for something new to take root. Yet the collapse was not only destruction, it was transformation. The end of the Bronze Age swept away the old order, but it opened space for new identities to emerge. The Canaanites who remained reshaped their lives, adapting to scarcity with resilience. The Israelites began to form their own distinct traditions. The Philistines introduced fresh technologies and customs. From the ruins, a new mosaic of peoples and cultures arose. The world had changed. Empires no longer guaranteed stability. Trade no longer tied the lands together in prosperity. In its place came uncertainty, but also possibility. Out of this crucible, Israel's story would begin to take shape, forged in the shadow of collapse, destined to redefine the meaning of survival and faith in a world that seemed to have lost both. The birth of Israel in the highlands. Out of the ashes of the Bronze Age, collapsed the hills of Canaan began to stir with new life. Where mighty cities once stood in ruin and coastal powers battled for control, the highlands, rugged, stony, and overlooked, offered a haven. It was here, among terraced slopes and rocky ridges, that a people began to coalesce into what history would one day know as Israel. Archaeology gives us glimpses of these beginnings. Small clusters of dwellings, little more than a handful of houses gathered around a shared courtyard, dot the highlands in this period. Their construction is simple, yet purposeful stone foundations supporting mud brick walls, roofs flat enough to dry grain or sleep beneath in the summer heat. These settlements were not grand cities, but they were sturdy, resilient, and communal. Pottery shards tell part of the story. Distinctive collared-rim storage jars appear across these sites, large vessels built to hold grain oil and water. Their ubiquity suggests a shared culture and a network of interrelated communities, all relying on similar strategies to endure the hardships of the hills. But perhaps the most intriguing clue lies not in what these settlements contain, but in what they lack: pig bones. Excavations reveal that unlike Canaanite and Philistine towns where pork was common, these highland villages show no trace of pigs in their diet. Whether this was a practical choice born of the difficulty of raising pigs in rugged terrain, or an early sign of cultural identity, it set them apart. Over time, this abstention became a marker of distinction, one thread in the tapestry of what would become Israelite tradition. Scholars debate how these people came to be here. Were they refugees from fallen Canaanite cities retreating into the hills for safety? Nomadic herders settling permanently as the great powers collapsed? Or a mix of both displaced populations blending with local tribes to forge a new identity? Whatever their origin, by the late 13th and early 12th centuries, BC, a unique culture was emerging in the Central Highlands, one that called itself by a new name, Israel. The first written mention of this people comes not from their own records, but from an Egyptian monument. The Meneptah stele, dating to around 1208 BC, boasts of Pharaoh's victories and notes, "Almost in passing Israel is laid, waste its seed is not." The phrasing is curious. Unlike cities which were described by their walls and fortifications, Israel is spoken of as a people, a tribal collective without a defined kingdom. This suggests that even Egypt recognized them not as a city-state, but as a rising identity. Life in these highlands was austere but steady. Families worked terraced fields, coaxing barley and wheat from thin soil. Goats and sheep grazed the hillsides, providing milk, wool, and meat. Water was precious, stored carefully in cisterns, guarded as the essence of survival. Religion, too, was different here. Unlike the monumental temples of the Canaanites, worship in these villages was modest, woven into the rhythms of daily life. Altars were simple and idols scarce. Something quieter, more austere was taking shape of faith, less dependent on images and more rooted in covenant and law. The Israelites at this stage were not yet kings or conquerors. They were hill farmers and herders, bound together by kinship and necessity, living on the margins of the land's wealthier cities and coastal powers, and yet, in their resilience, in their shared practices, in their stubborn refusal to vanish, they carried within them the seed of something extraordinary. From these modest villages would arise a story that would echo across millennia. But for now, Israel was only beginning, an emerging people living in the shadow of collapse, learning how to endure in a land forever shaped by struggle. Life in the hill villages. In the highlands of Canaan, life was carved from stone and sweat. These were not lands of plenty like the lush Nile Valley, nor great river plains like Mesopotamia. Here, survival demanded ingenuity and persistence. Families built terraces into the rocky slopes, transforming inhospitable ridges into fields that could bear grain and vines. Every stone wall was a triumph over gravity and erosion, a visible testament to a people determined to stay rooted in the land. Daily rhythms began with the sun. Men and women rose together, tending to goats and sheep that provided milk, wool, and hides. Fields of barley and wheat required constant care, sowing, weeding, harvesting, and threshing under the relentless sun. Olive trees, stubbornly clinging to terraces, were pruned and watched carefully, their fruit destined to be pressed into oil, both sustenance and currency. Vineyards, too, lined the slopes, their clusters harvested in autumn to be crushed into jars of wine stored for winter feasts and rituals. The houses themselves reflected the communal life of these villages. Built around courtyards, they were simple stone foundations, mud brick walls, roofs, flat enough to serve as workspaces. Within, small hearths provided warmth and food, while clay jars lined the walls filled with grain and oil. Families lived close extended kin, bound together not just by blood but by necessity. To survive here, no one could stand alone. Water defined everything. Wells were dug, deep cisterns carved into the rock to capture precious rain. Villages organized their lives around these sources, guarding them fiercely, for a single dry season could spell disaster. Children carried jars to and from the cisterns, their bare feet pattering on dusty paths, their laughter a counterpoint to the gravity of survival. And yet life was not only toil. The cycle of the seasons brought moments of joy and celebration. Harvest festivals marked the turning of the year, feasts accompanied by song and dance rituals offered to ensure the earth's continued fertility. Oral traditions flourished here, stories of ancestors, of battles fought and gods encountered, carried from generation to generation around the flicker of firelight. These tales bound the people together as surely as their stone walls did, giving shape to a shared identity. Unlike the great cities of the coast, these villages left little grandeur behind, no towering temples, no palaces adorned with imported luxuries. Their legacy was quieter, found in the continuity of life and the resilience of communities who endured where empires crumbled. The people of the highlands were not wealthy, but they were free, unshackled from the tribute and labor demands that coastal kings and foreign overlords imposed on their subjects. Religion, too, reflected this simplicity. While neighboring Canaanites worshipped in lavish temples to Baal and Asherah, the highland communities favored modest altars and sacred spaces closer to home. Figurines have been found, but large temple complexes are absent. Their worship was less about spectacle and more about relationship rituals that tied families to the divine in quiet, enduring ways. In this way, a new culture slowly took form, defined not by monumental wealth but by endurance, not by opulence but by kinship. These hill villages may not have looked like the heroes of epic tales, but in their stubborn survival they were laying the groundwork for a story far greater than themselves. A story that would one day shape nations, faiths, and civilizations far beyond their rocky slopes. Judges and tribal confederation, the people of the highlands had found ways to endure, but endurance alone could not shield them from danger. Around them the world was restless. The Philistines pressed inland from their fortified coastal towns, armed with iron and organized armies. To the east, Moabites and Ammonites guarded their territories with suspicion. Bandits prowled the roads, and rival clans within Canaan itself fought over scarce resources. Against such pressures, the scattered Israelite villages could not rely on stone walls or bronze swords alone. They needed leaders. These leaders were not kings. They were judges, figures who rose in times of crisis, chosen not by royal lineage, but by charisma, courage, or divine favor. They were warriors, prophets, strategists, sometimes all three. When danger struck, a judge could rally the tribes, unite scattered settlements into a fighting force, and strike back against their oppressors. When the crisis passed, their authority dissolved and the tribes returned to their independent lives. It was a system built on necessity, fragile yet functional, as unpredictable as the storms that swept across the land. The stories of the judges later preserved in Scripture reveal the character of this era. There was Deborah, the prophetess, who judged from beneath a palm tree and rallied Israel to victory against Canaanite chariots. There was Gideon, who threshed wheat in secret before leading a small band to rout a far larger army, his triumph framed as proof that the divine favored the weak over the mighty. There was Samson, whose raw strength made him both hero and cautionary tale, entangled in love and vengeance until his final act of destruction. These tales are more than folklore. They reflect the precariousness of life in this period, moments of deliverance followed by relapse into vulnerability. Without a central authority, unity was fleeting. Each tribe clung to its independence, cooperating only when the threat was too great to ignore. The system depended on persuasion, not coercion, on shared values, not permanent institutions. And yet this decentralization carried its own kind of strength. It bred resilience, adaptability, and a fierce sense of local identity. No single disaster could annihilate the whole, for there was no central heart to strike. The Israelites were a network of kin-based communities capable of dissolving and reforming like water, slipping through stone. Religion played a central role in binding them together. The judges often framed their leadership as divinely sanctioned their victories, credited to the favor of a God who demanded loyalty and obedience. When defeat came, it was interpreted not simply as military failure, but as a sign of spiritual unfaithfulness. This moral dimension turned political struggle into sacred drama, giving each generation a lens through which to interpret its hardships. Still, the limitations of this confederation were clear. Without permanent structures, the tribes could not maintain standing armies, enforce law across regions, or sustain long campaigns. As enemies grew stronger and external pressures mounted, the need for more lasting unity became undeniable. The age of the judges was one of improvisation and survival, a period when leaders emerged like sparks in the dark, blazing brightly for a moment before fading. But from this unstable system, the seeds of monarchy were sown. The people had seen what unity under a strong leader could achieve, even if only temporarily. They had tasted the possibility of lasting protection. And soon they would begin to ask, not for another judge, but for a king. The rise of Saul. The call for a king did not come from ambition, it came from fear. By the late 11th century BC, the Philistines had become the great menace of the highlands. Settled along the coastal plain, they had established fortified cities like Ashdod, Ashkelon, and Gath. They controlled iron production, giving them weapons stronger and sharper than the bronze blades of their neighbors. Their armies were organized, disciplined, and capable of crushing tribal militias that relied on little more than courage and kinship. For Israel's scattered villages, survival was no longer guaranteed. The people, weary of insecurity, demanded a new form of leadership. They no longer wanted leaders who rose only in times of crisis and faded away once the danger passed. They wanted permanence, a single figure who could unify the tribe's command armies and stand against the Philistine threat. For the first time, the cry for a king echoed through the highlands. Into this moment stepped Saul, a farmer from the tribe of Benjamin, described as standing head and shoulders above his peers. His physical presence matched the image of kingship that the people desired, tall, commanding a figure to inspire confidence on the battlefield. But his rise was not merely about stature. It carried the weight of divine sanction. Prophets declared that he had been chosen by God, anointed with oil, as a visible sign of sacred authority. For a people accustomed to judges, this was something new, a leader whose legitimacy was not temporary but enduring, bound to both heaven and earth. At first, Saul proved himself. He rallied the tribes with unexpected energy, striking against enemies and securing victories that gave the Israelites a sense of unity they had never known. Under his leadership, the scattered villages began to imagine themselves as a nation. For the first time, the dream of standing against their rivals without fear seemed within reach. Yet monarchy was a double-edged sword. To be king was to bear not only authority but responsibility, and the weight of expectation pressed heavily upon Saul. The same independence that had made the tribes wary of foreign domination also made them difficult to govern. Loyalties shifted quickly, dissent lingered beneath the surface, and every decision was scrutinized not only by warriors and elders but by prophets who judged the king by divine standards. Saul's story is both triumph and tragedy. His reign marked the beginning of Israel's transformation from a loose tribal confederation into a centralized kingdom. He embodied the hopes of a people desperate for stability, but he also revealed the dangers of concentrated power. The man who was chosen for his stature and strength would struggle with insecurity and doubt, torn between the demands of rule and the burden of divine expectation. And yet his reign opened a door that could never again be closed. Israel had its first king. The experiment had begun. The question was whether monarchy would secure their survival or unravel them from within. David, the warrior, poet. Saul had given the Israelites their first taste of kingship, but it was David who would etch his name into memory as both conqueror and creator. His story begins humbly, shepherd boy, youngest of his brothers, overlooked by many but not by destiny. In fields where flocks grazed beneath the sun, he learned to wield the sling and the lyre skills that would serve him in ways no one could have foreseen. The tale that made him famous still reverberates across time. David, standing against Goliath, the Philistine giant, armored and taunting, seemed invincible, yet the boy stepped forward with nothing but faith, a sling, and 5 smooth stones. When one stone struck true, the giant fell, and with him fell the illusion that Israel was powerless. In that moment, David became more than a shepherd. He became a symbol of courage, a reminder that determination and belief could topple even the greatest of enemies. His fame spread quickly. Songs were sung in his honor, chants of "Saul has slain his thousands, but David his tens of thousands," echoing through the villages. Such praise, intoxicating to the people, planted seeds of jealousy in Saul's heart. What began as admiration between king and young warrior soured into suspicion, and suspicion deepened into paranoia. Saul's fear turned him against David, driving the younger man into exile. But exile did not break him. Instead, it forged him. Wandering the wilderness, David gathered around himself a band of misfits, outcasts, debtors, men with nowhere else to go. What seemed like a rabble became the nucleus of a loyal army bound by hardship and loyalty to their leader. David proved not only his skill as a warrior, but his gift for leadership, shaping loyalty from desperation and forging order from chaos. Even as he fought, David composed. He sang psalms of lament and praise verses that captured both the anguish of pursuit and the ecstasy of faith. His words, intimate and universal, gave voice to a people's struggles and hopes. In him, warrior and poet were united, blade and lyre, courage and song. Few leaders in history have embodied such duality. When Saul's reign finally collapsed under the weight of his own insecurities, David was ready. He stepped into the role not merely as a usurper, but as a man who had endured trial and exile, a man tempered like iron in the fire of adversity. His ascension was more than political, it was symbolic. The tribes weary of division found in him a figure capable of uniting them not just by command, but by charisma, vision, and faith. David's story is not one of perfection. His reign would later be marred by conflict and scandal, but in this moment of rise he was the warrior poet, a man whose courage defeated giants, whose words touched heaven, and whose leadership promised to bind Israel into a nation. From shepherd to king, his journey was the embodiment of transformation, the kind of story that could only have been born in the crucible of Canaan, Jerusalem, and empire. When David rose from outlaw to king, he faced a fragmented land. The tribes were united in name, but divided in heart, their loyalties fragile, their enemies pressing from every side. To bind them, David needed more than charisma or victory. He needed a symbol, a place that could stand at the center of a people, still learning to think of themselves as one nation. He found it in a city perched on a ridge between the highlands, Jerusalem. At the time, Jerusalem was a Jebusite stronghold, small but strategically positioned. It sat between the northern and southern tribes, neither belonging to one nor the other. By seizing it, David achieved brilliance. He claimed neutral ground, a city that could serve as the unifying heart of Israel without favoring any tribe. The capture itself was bold. Tradition remembers his warriors scaling the water shaft, striking swiftly and toppling the defenders who had mocked him. In triumph, David made Jerusalem his capital, but he did more than move his throne there. He brought the Ark of the Covenant, the sacred chest said to hold the tablets of law, into the city. This act transformed Jerusalem from a political center into a spiritual one. Priests and people alike followed in celebration, the air filled with the sound of cymbals, harps, and dancing. The city was no longer just stone walls and gates. It became the dwelling place of divine presence, the beating heart of both governance and faith. From this center, David expanded outward. His armies pushed the borders of Israel to their greatest extent, from the Euphrates in the north to the edges of Egypt in the south. Moab, Edom, Ammon all fell under his authority, paying tribute to the king who had once been an exile. The highland villages that had once hidden from enemies now looked to Jerusalem as the capital of a growing empire. And yet David was not only a conqueror, he built systems to manage what he had won. He appointed officials, organized scribes, and created structures to collect tribute and oversee justice. Where Saul had been a warrior pressed by necessity, David was a king who laid foundations of administration. He transformed a tribal confederation into something closer to a state where decisions carried the weight of enduring institutions. Still, his reign was not without shadows. The sword never truly left his house. Civil wars, rivalries, and personal failings scarred his rule. Yet even in failure, David's figure loomed larger than life warrior, poet, prophet, and king. His psalms echoed with both triumph and despair, giving voice to the contradictions of a man who carried both greatness and grief. In Jerusalem, David established more than a capital. He created a symbol that would outlive him, a city destined to endure, as the focal point of faith, politics, and longing. What began as a neutral ridge between tribes became the soul of a people, and from its gates, David's empire radiated, an empire born not only of conquest, but of vision. Solomon, the Builder King. When David's reign ended, the crown passed to his son Solomon, a young man whose gifts were not those of a warrior, but of a builder and diplomat. Where David's hands were stained with battle, Solomon's were inked with treaties and blueprints. His rule would be remembered less for conquest and more for construction, for transforming Israel from a kingdom of soldiers into a state of splendor. From the moment he took the throne, Solomon understood the importance of consolidating power through stability. He cemented alliances by marriage, binding Israel to neighboring peoples in webs of diplomacy. His court became a place where foreign envoys gathered, bearing gifts of tribute and pledges of peace. Instead of war banners, his reign was marked by the sound of scribes scratching on tablets and masons chiseling stone. The most enduring of his projects was the temple in Jerusalem. Rising from the city David had chosen, it became the visible dwelling place of Israel's God. Built with cedar from Lebanon, quarried stone from the highlands, and adorned with gold and precious metals, the temple was more than architecture, it was a statement. For the first time, worship of Israel's God had a central sanctuary fixed in place where the divine presence was believed to dwell in sacred permanence. Pilgrims would ascend the hills to its courts, their prayers joining in the incense smoke that curled toward the heavens. But Solomon's ambitions extended beyond Jerusalem. Across the kingdom he fortified key cities, Hazor in the north, Megiddo on the trade routes, and Gaza guarding the approach to the coast. These were not only strongholds but administrative centers, hubs of governance, where royal officials managed tribute, oversaw supplies, and kept order in the king's name. Roads were improved, storehouses constructed, and garrisons installed, knitting together a realm that stretched wider than any Israelite king had yet ruled. The military, too, was reshaped. Solomon introduced chariot forces modeled on Egyptian and Mesopotamian examples, giving Israel mobile striking power. Iron weaponry became standard issue for his soldiers, narrowing the technological gap with their rivals. Yet Solomon preferred to deploy these forces not in endless war, but in ensuring peace through strength. His reign was remembered as one of relative calm, secured by the weight of both arms and diplomacy. At court, culture blossomed. Tales of Solomon's wisdom spread far beyond Israel's borders, attracting foreign dignitaries who marveled at his judgments and his wealth. The famous visit of the Queen of Sheba, whether legend or memory, captured this spirit of admiration, a moment when the small kingdom of the highlands seemed to shine on the world stage. Still, this grandeur came at a cost. The temple and palaces required heavy taxation and forced labor. Villages that had once lived freely now sent their sons to work on royal projects. While Solomon's reign dazzled with its monuments, the burdens fell heavily on the common people. For them, the shining stones of the temple might also have been reminders of sweat and toil. Yet for all its contradictions, Solomon's rule marked a turning point. The kingdom was no longer merely a patchwork of tribes or the personal realm of a warrior king. It had become an organized state with institutions, fortresses, and a capital that commanded both awe and loyalty. Solomon's vision fixed Israel's identity in stone and cedar, leaving behind a legacy as enduring as the walls he raised. He was the builder-king, the architect of grandeur, and while his reign would not escape the seeds of discontent in its time, it stood as a golden age, a moment when the dream of a united, prosperous Israel seemed not only possible, but real. The golden age and its shadows. Under Solomon, Israel gleamed with a brilliance the highlands had never seen before. Trade routes thrummed with activity, the storehouses of the kingdom overflowed with grain, and Jerusalem rose above its ridges, crowned by the magnificent temple and royal palaces. For the first time, Israel stood as more than a confederation or a fragile experiment in monarchy. It was a kingdom of stature, acknowledged by its neighbors, admired by visiting dignitaries, and feared by rivals. The wealth was undeniable. From the Phoenician coast came cedar, and craftsmen from Arabia caravans brought gold and spices, and from distant lands came horses, ivory, and precious gems. Tribute flowed from subject peoples and allies alike, filling the treasury. In the court of Solomon, scribes recorded ledgers of income, expenditures, and supplies with precision, a reflection of the bureaucratic machine that now underpinned royal power. Yet beneath this grandeur, shadows lengthened. For the common people, prosperity was not evenly shared. Heavy taxation weighed on households, and conscripted labor took men from their families to build palaces, fortresses, and monumental works. A farmer might spend months away from his fields, his hands blistered not from tending olive trees but from hauling stones for royal projects. While the king's name gleamed with wealth, many of his subjects bore the weight of his ambition. The strain was not only economic but spiritual. The temple in Jerusalem was a triumph, but Solomon also permitted shrines to foreign gods, often to honor the traditions of his many wives from neighboring lands. High places to Astarte, Chemosh, and Molech rose alongside altars to Israel's God, provoking discontent among priests and prophets who demanded singular devotion. The people once bound by shared covenant now found their faith divided, their worship fragmented. Politically, cracks also began to form. The unity David had fought so hard to secure began to fray under the pressure of competing interests. Northern tribes, wealthier and less bound to Jerusalem, resented the dominance of the southern court. Grievances accumulated. Why should their labor build monuments far from their own land? Why should their tribute enrich a throne that seemed increasingly distant from their struggles? Foreign alliances, once a source of strength, also carried danger. With every marriage treaty and diplomatic bond, Israel tied itself to the fates of larger powers. To some, these ties brought prestige. To others, they represented compromise and corruption. The Golden Age glittered, but its brilliance masked tensions that grew sharper with each passing year. Even Solomon himself seemed aware of the paradox. Wisdom literature attributed to his reign wrestles with themes of vanity, futility, and the fleeting nature of wealth. All is vanity, the voice laments, as though acknowledging that even the greatest accomplishments cannot outlast the weight of time. And so Israel basked in its golden age, admired from abroad and enriched at home. But prosperity carried its price. Beneath the splendor of cedar halls and golden courts lay dissatisfaction brewing like storm clouds over the hills. The people had gained a kingdom that shone brighter than any they had known, but the very brilliance of its success was sowing the seeds of division that would one day tear it apart. The Great Schism. When Solomon's reign ended around 930 BC, the kingdom stood at a crossroads. For all its splendor, the burdens of forced labor taxation and religious compromise had eroded loyalty among many tribes. At the coronation of his son Rehoboam, the people gathered not in celebration, but with petitions on their lips. They begged him to ease the yoke his father had laid upon them. Rehoboam, young and proud, consulted his advisers. The elders counseled moderation. Serve the people and they will serve you. But his younger companions urged severity. Make your rule harsher, prove your strength. Rehoboam chose pride over prudence. His declaration was like a spark in dry grass. My father made your yoke heavy, he said. I will make it heavier. My father scourged you with whips. I will scourge you with scorpions. The words shattered fragile unity. The northern tribes, weary of Jerusalem's dominance, rose in fury. Their cry rang out, "We have no share in David, no inheritance in the son of Jesse." With that the kingdom fractured. Jeroboam, once a trusted official under Solomon, became leader of the northern revolt. Crowned king over 10 tribes, he established the new realm of Israel, its capital, shifting from Shechem to Tirzah and eventually to Samaria. To solidify independence, Jeroboam built alternative sanctuaries at Bethel and Dan, placing golden calves there as symbols of divine presence. These were not necessarily idols in the way critics later described them, but political symbols, a way of keeping the northern tribes from journeying south to worship at Jerusalem's temple. In Judah, Rehoboam retained only the tribes of Judah and Benjamin ruling from Jerusalem. Though smaller in territory, the southern kingdom held the temple, the ark, and the lineage of David, a spiritual legitimacy that the north could never fully replicate. The schism thus ran deeper than politics. It divided faith, ritual, and identity. The contrast between the two realms was stark. Israel in the north was wealthier, its fertile plains and trade routes bringing prosperity. Yet it was also more unstable dynasties, rising and falling in quick succession. Judah in the south was poorer, hemmed in by geography, but it possessed continuity, a single dynasty ruling in Jerusalem, a steady thread in a turbulent tapestry. For the people, the division was both freedom and loss. In Israel, they escaped the heavy yoke of Solomon's successors, but they also fractured the unity that had made the kingdom strong. In Judah, they retained the temple and the Davidic line, but they carried the weight of diminished power. Families were split across borders, festivals divided, alliances redrawn. What had once been one kingdom became 2 rivals, sometimes allies, often enemies. The schism was more than political. It was the beginning of a long rivalry that would shape the fate of both nations. From this point forward, Israel and Judah would live side by side, bound by shared ancestry, yet separated by suspicion, envy, and competing visions of faith and power. The golden age of unity was gone, replaced by 2 kingdoms, whose destinies would now unfold on separate, often tragic paths, the Northern Kingdom's experiments. In the aftermath of the schism, the Kingdom of Israel in the north surged with energy and ambition. Freed from Jerusalem's control, it sought to carve out its own identity, one that would rival or even eclipse Judah. Its lands stretched across fertile valleys and rich plains, far more productive than the rugged highlands of the south. Trade routes pulsed through its territory, carrying wealth from caravan merchants and coastal exchanges. By geography alone, Israel seemed destined for greatness. Yet with prosperity came instability. Unlike Judah, where David's dynasty remained unbroken, the north knew constant upheaval. Dynasties rose and fell, kings toppled by rivals' assassination, staining the palace floors with blood. Power shifted like desert winds, leaving uncertainty at the heart of governance. Still amid this turbulence, certain rulers left their mark. Omri was one such figure. Rising from a time of chaos, he established a dynasty that stabilized the kingdom. He founded a new capital, Samaria, strategically placed atop a hill, fortified and designed to project strength. From there, Israel radiated influence across the region. His son Ahab expanded this legacy further, marrying Jezebel, daughter of a Phoenician king. This union bound Israel to the wealthy coastal trade networks and introduced Phoenician religious practices into Israelite life. It was here that tensions sharpened between politics and prophecy. Jezebel championed the worship of Baal, building temples and altars in honor of the storm god. For many Israelites, this was pragmatic diplomacy, aligning their kingdom with powerful neighbors. But for the prophets it was betrayal. Voices like Elijah rose in fierce opposition, confronting kings and thundering against idolatry. The famous contest on Mount Carmel, fire from heaven consuming Elijah's offering while Baal's prophets stood powerless, symbolized more than religion. It was a struggle over the very soul of Israel. Should the kingdom follow the gods of prosperity or remain faithful to the covenant that had shaped its beginnings? Despite these tensions, the northern kingdom thrived economically. Ivory-inlaid palaces and opulent goods unearthed in Samaria testify to wealth that rivaled even the courts of older empires. The markets bustled with merchants, grain flowed from fertile fields, and tribute from subject peoples enriched the treasury. To foreign observers, Israel was no fragile state, but a rising power capable of fielding armies, forging alliances, and making itself heard on the international stage. And yet the fault lines were always visible. Religious pluralism, fractured spiritual unity, dynastic instability, weakened political trust, and the prosperity of elites contrasted sharply with the struggles of common farmers. Prophets like Amos condemned the inequities of society. Luxury bought at the cost of justice, wealth piled high, while the poor were trampled in the dust. These voices revealed that beneath the glitter of success, resentment simmered. The northern kingdom of Israel experimented with power, prosperity, and identity. It reached for greatness, embraced trade and diplomacy, and at times seemed to rival the mightiest nations around it. But its foundations were fragile, its unity thin. In its daring experiments lay both its brilliance and the seeds of its undoing, a reminder that kingdoms can shine brightly, but brilliance without balance cannot endure. Judah's struggle for survival. While the northern kingdom of Israel embraced wealth trade and experimentation, the southern kingdom of Judah followed a different path, smaller, poorer, and often overshadowed yet steadier. in its dynastic line and spiritual focus. Nestled in the rugged highlands around Jerusalem, Judah lacked the fertile plains and coastal access that enriched its northern neighbor. What it possessed instead was endurance rooted in the Davidic dynasty and the temple that David and Solomon had established at the heart of the capital. Jerusalem remained the crown jewel of Judah, though more modest in grandeur compared to Samaria's ivory palaces or Phoenicia's bustling ports. Here the temple anchored identity, its priests and rituals, reinforcing the legitimacy of the Davidic kingship. Even when Judah's borders shrank, even when its wealth faltered, the temple stood as a reminder that the people of Judah carried a covenantal destiny unlike any other. To them, monarchy was not simply a political arrangement, but a divine inheritance, a promise that the house of David would endure. The kings of Judah faced immense challenges, encircled by rivals, Philistines to the west, Edomites to the south, Moabites and Ammonites to the east. They fought to defend their fragile borders. Some, like Asa, achieved victories that brought fleeting peace. Asa's reforms, tearing down foreign altars and renewing devotion to Israel's God, strengthened national resolve. Later, kings like Jehoshaphat sought alliances to secure survival, though such partnerships often entangled Judah in foreign conflicts. But it was Hezekiah generations later who embodied Judah's struggle most clearly. Confronted by the looming threat of the Assyrian Empire, he fortified Jerusalem, redirected water through hidden tunnels to sustain the city under siege, and called upon the people to place their trust not in foreign armies, but in their God. His religious reforms, removing high places, smashing idols and centralizing worship in Jerusalem, were as much political acts as spiritual ones, an effort to unify a small kingdom under one faith and one throne. Judah's existence was precarious, a balancing act between faith and diplomacy. Unlike Israel, it did not enjoy the wealth of fertile valleys or bustling trade routes. Its economy was rooted in subsistence farming, shepherding, and small-scale trade. But with less came also less corruption of power. Judah was not consumed by the same cycles of dynastic assassinations that plagued the north. Stability, even in poverty, became its quiet strength. And yet Judah was not immune to decline. Corrupt rulers occasionally abandoned reform, reintroducing foreign practices or failing to heed prophetic warnings. The voices of prophets, Isaiah in particular, thundered in Jerusalem's streets, warning kings that survival would depend not on tribute or alliances, but on faithfulness to the covenant. These messages revealed Judah's constant tension to lean on worldly powers or to cling to divine promise. For centuries, Judah endured in the shadow of larger neighbors, overlooked by some, pitied by others. But its resilience carried it through wars, sieges, and famine. Unlike the northern kingdom, which dazzled before burning out, Judah persisted with stubborn endurance. Its story was not one of sudden brilliance, but of survival against impossible odds, a struggle that would one day define not only its fate, but the spiritual imagination of generations to come, the Assyrian storm. The 8th century BC brought with it a storm from the east, one unlike anything the Levant had faced before. The Assyrian Empire, forged in the valleys of the Tigris, expanded with relentless force. Their armies were disciplined, their siege engines unmatched, their cruelty legendary. Where they marched, resistance crumbled, and soon their gaze fell upon the divided kingdoms of Israel and Judah. For the northern kingdom, Assyria's advance was catastrophic. Israel, though wealthy and expansive, was weakened by political instability. Kings rose and fell in quick succession, often through bloody coups. The people, prosperous yet fractured, were ill prepared for the discipline of an empire that measured conquest not in raids but in systematic domination. Assyrian armies advanced like thunderclouds, their chariots clattering, their banners snapping in the wind. They besieged cities with towers and battering rams, starving defenders into surrender. Captured towns were burned, their leaders impaled or flayed as warnings to others. The message was clear: submission or annihilation. In this brutal new order, compromise was survival. Samaria, Israel's proud capital, became the ultimate target. For years it resisted, perched on its fortified hill, but Assyrian persistence was inexhaustible. Siege walls tightened, supplies dwindled, and finally, in 722 BC, Samaria fell. The northern kingdom of Israel was no more. Its people were deported in waves, scattered across the empire, in a policy designed to erase identity and quell rebellion. Foreign settlers were brought in to replace them, mingling and reshaping the land's culture. The 10 tribes of Israel, once vibrant and defiant, vanished into history's shadows, remembered as the lost tribes. The fall of Israel shook the region. For Judah, smaller and weaker, the implications were terrifying. If mighty Israel could not withstand Assyria, what hope did Jerusalem have? Yet Judah endured for a time by walking a razor's edge. Tribute was paid, diplomacy, attempted reforms enacted to strengthen resolve. Hezekiah's defiance against Assyria nearly brought disaster when Sennacherib's armies swept into Judah, capturing dozens of fortified towns. Only Jerusalem remained, its walls fortified, its water secured by Hezekiah's tunnel carved through solid rock to ensure survival under siege. Assyrian records boast of shutting up Hezekiah like a bird in a cage. Yet the city did not fall. Whether through plague in the Assyrian camp, divine intervention, as some claimed, or simple calculation, that the cost of conquest outweighed the reward, Sennacherib withdrew. Judah, battered but unbroken, lived on. Still the shadow of Assyria lingered. For those who survived, the message was clear: no kingdom was safe, no people immune. The Assyrian storm had swept the north into oblivion, and though Judah remained, its survival seemed a fragile miracle. Every prayer in Jerusalem carried the weight of fear, and every prophet's cry rang louder: turn back to faith, for without it even the walls of Zion could not stand forever. Prophets and warnings. As the Assyrian storm battered the Levant, voices rose from within Israel and Judah that did not speak with swords or strategies, but with fire and urgency. These were the prophets men called not to flatter kings, but to confront them, not to soothe the people, but to unsettle them. Their warnings cut through the noise of politics and war, insisting that the true battle was not against Assyria or any empire, but against faithlessness itself. Amos was among the first. A shepherd from Tekoa, he strode into the northern kingdom with words sharp as iron. He denounced the wealthy who reclined on ivory couches while the poor were sold for a pair of sandals. His voice thundered that festivals and sacrifices meant nothing if justice was trampled in the streets. Let justice roll down like waters, he proclaimed, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. For Amos' survival depended not on fortresses or tribute, but on moral integrity, a message that struck at the heart of a prosperous but corrupt society. Hosea, another prophet of the north, spoke through the language of heartbreak. His own marriage, marked by betrayal, became a symbol of Israel's unfaithfulness to its God. Yet even as he condemned the nation's infidelity, his words carried a haunting tenderness, a call to return, to be restored, to rediscover covenant love. In Hosea's voice, judgment and mercy intertwined, revealing a God both wounded and unrelenting in compassion. In Judah, Isaiah emerged during the reign of Hezekiah. His vision was sweeping, cosmic in scope. He warned of judgment against arrogance and injustice, yet he also offered visions of hope, a day when nations would stream to Jerusalem, when swords would be beaten into plowshares, when a remnant would survive to bear the light of covenant faith. Standing before kings, he urged them to trust not in alliances with Egypt or Assyria, but in divine faithfulness. His words turned politics into prophecy, framing every decision as a test of covenant loyalty. These prophets were not mere commentators. They were lightning rods channeling divine outrage and divine promise. They spoke to farmers in fields, to merchants in marketplaces, to kings in their courts. Their words unsettled the comfortable and gave courage to the oppressed. They reframed calamity as consequence, not proof that the gods were weak, but that the people had strayed from their path. And yet their warnings often went unheeded. Kings preferred alliances and armies, priests preferred rituals that maintained order, and the wealthy dismissed calls for justice. The prophets were mocked, persecuted, ignored, but their words endured, etched into scrolls, carried in memory, whispered in exile. In the end, the prophet's message was stark. Walls could fall, kingdoms could vanish, but covenant faithfulness, or the lack of it, was what truly determined a people's fate. Their warnings hung over Israel and Judah like storm clouds, heavy with truth. And when the storms of history broke, those who remembered the prophets would find in their words not only judgment, but also the seeds of hope. Babylonian conquest and exile. The fall of Israel had already shown the world what the Assyrian Empire could do, but in time Assyria's own power waned, and from the plains of Mesopotamia rose a new force, Babylon. Under the fierce leadership of Nebuchadnezzar II, the Babylonians inherited the mantle of empire, sweeping westward with armies hardened in conquest. For Judah, already fragile and diminished, the coming of Babylon would prove a trial from which there would be no easy escape. The Babylonian advance came in waves. At first, Judah tried to maneuver to balance tribute and diplomacy, to cling to independence while appeasing the conqueror. But rebellions flared, fueled by prophets who urged faith in divine deliverance, by kings who believed Egypt might yet ride to their rescue, and by people who could not imagine Jerusalem, the city of the temple, falling. Each rebellion only provoked harsher Babylonian response. In 597 BC, Jerusalem faced its first great blow. Nebuchadnezzar besieged the city and the gates were forced open. The king Jehoiakim, his court, and thousands of skilled workers, craftsmen and warriors were carried away into exile. It was a calculated act. Babylon did not seek to annihilate Judah immediately, but to strip it of its strength, leaving behind a weakened remnant under puppet rule. But Judah's spirit was not easily subdued. Defiance rose again under King Zedekiah, who gambled on rebellion, hoping against hope for divine intervention or Egyptian aid. This final gamble sealed Jerusalem's fate. In 586 BC, the Babylonians returned with fury. They surrounded the city, cutting off supplies, tightening the noose, until famine stalked the streets. Mothers cradled starving children. Priests watched as the temple courtyards grew silent. Warriors grew too weak to lift their swords. When at last the walls were breached, destruction came with merciless completeness. The temple, the very heart of Judah's identity, was put to the torch, its gold stripped, its sacred vessels carried to Babylon. Palaces crumbled, homes burned, and the city that had been the pride of David and Solomon was reduced to smouldering ruins. The Davidic king was blinded and dragged away in chains, his sons slain before his eyes. The people who survived were bound and marched eastward captives in a land they had never seen. This was more than conquest, it was trauma seared into memory. The exile was not simply the loss of land, but the collapse of identity. The covenant people found themselves without temple, without king, without homeland. For many it felt as though their God had abandoned them, or worse, been defeated. How could the city where his name dwelt lie in ashes? How could his people be scattered among foreign tongues? Yet even in this devastation a paradox stirred. The very act of exile preserved the people. Scattered though they were, they carried their traditions with them. Songs of lament arose by the rivers of Babylon, psalms that remembered Zion even in captivity. Prophets reframed the disaster not as divine abandonment, but as consequence and purification, a call to return to faith, even if the land itself was lost. The Babylonian conquest was the end of an era. The kingdom of Judah was gone, its walls shattered, its temple destroyed. But in the ashes, something enduring was being forged, a faith no longer tied to a single city or throne, but carried within the hearts and texts of a people who refused to disappear. Faith in a foreign land. Exile was more than displacement, it was disorientation. The people of Judah found themselves far from their hills and valleys, far from Jerusalem's temple, surrounded by the towering ziggurats and bustling markets of Babylon. Captives in a land of strange gods and unfamiliar tongues, they faced a question that cut to the core of their existence. Could a covenant people survive without the land that defined them? Daily life in exile was marked by paradox. On one hand, many deportees were settled into Babylonian society with opportunities to work farm or serve in skilled trades. They were not shackled in chains for eternity, nor entirely stripped of agency. Some even prospered, rising to positions of influence within the empire. Yet the shadow of loss remained. Their homeland lay in ruins, their temple burned, their king dethroned. Every field they tilled in Babylon reminded them of vineyards abandoned in Judah. Every festival celebrated by foreigners reminded them of songs silenced in Zion. To survive, they adapted. Worship, once centered on sacrifice at the temple, now shifted to prayer song and study. Communities gathered by the rivers lifting their voices in lament and remembrance. By the rivers of Babylon we sat and wept when we remembered Zion, the psalmist wrote, capturing both grief and determination. The covenant was no longer tied solely to place. It became portable, carried in memory and in practice. Prophets helped reframe exile not as the end, but as chastening and renewal. Ezekiel himself, among the exiles, spoke of visions where dry bones would rise to life, a metaphor of restoration for a people who felt cut off and dead. Jeremiah, who had remained in Judah, sent letters urging the exiles to seek peace in the cities where they now lived, to plant gardens and raise families, for their story was not over. Even in a foreign land they were still bound to their God, and He had not abandoned them. In Babylon, texts were written, edited, and preserved stories of origins, laws of covenant, psalms of lament and praise. The exile became a crucible in which oral traditions crystallized into sacred scripture. What had once been memory became text, what had once been ritual became law, and what had once been local faith became a universal vision of endurance. And something else stirred identity, deepened. Stripped of king, temple, and land, the people of Judah turned inward to the only thing that could not be taken, their covenant relationship with the divine. If empire had scattered them, then faith would hold them together. No matter how far from Jerusalem they were carried, they remained one people, bound not by borders, but by belief. Exile, meant to erase them, became instead the seedbed of resilience. Babylon's palaces glittered, but the true endurance lay in the prayers whispered in small gatherings, the songs sung in hushed tones, the scrolls inked in exile. Their faith had left the temple and taken root in the heart, where no conqueror's fire could reach. Thus in foreign land the people endured. They bent beneath empire's weight but did not break. And in their endurance they discovered something profound, that covenant was not bound to walls of stone or kings on thrones, but to the steadfastness of a God who went with them into exile and would one day call them home, return and rebuilding. When Babylon's power waned, a new empire rose in the east, the Persians under Cyrus the Great. Unlike the Babylonians, who had sought to scatter and assimilate their captives, Cyrus pursued a different vision of rule. His empire was vast, stretching across lands and peoples of every tongue, and he sought stability not through suppression, but through tolerance. In 539 BC, Babylon fell to his armies, and soon after he issued a decree that changed the destiny of Judah's exiles. They were free to return home. The journey back was bittersweet. After decades in Babylon, many had built new lives, and not all chose to leave. Those who returned traveled not to a land of glory, but to ruins. Jerusalem was a shadow of its former self, its walls broken, its temple reduced to ash and rubble. Fields lay untended, villages empty, and neighboring peoples had moved into lands once theirs. The homecoming was not triumph, but challenge, how to restore what had been lost, and how to do so while surrounded by suspicion and resistance. Under leaders like Zerubbabel, a descendant of David and Joshua the high priest, the first priority became rebuilding the temple. Stones were gathered, foundations laid, and the work began. But progress was slow. Local opposition, economic hardship, and wavering morale delayed construction. For years the site lay unfinished, the people struggling to balance survival with the demands of restoration. Yet prophets like Haggai and Zechariah urged perseverance, declaring that even a modest second temple would carry divine presence. When at last the temple was completed, it marked more than architecture. It was a statement that covenant life continued, that worship could resume, and that identity endured even after exile. Pilgrims once again climbed the hills to Jerusalem, their songs rising with the smoke of sacrifices, a fragile but powerful echo of the glory days of Solomon. But rebuilding a temple was only part of the struggle. The deeper challenge lay in rebuilding a people. Ezra, a priest and scribe, arrived later with authority to teach the law and enforce covenant practices. He emphasized purity, calling for the dissolution of marriages with foreigners, demanding strict adherence to sacred texts, and renewing the people's commitment to their God. Nehemiah, a governor sent by the Persian court, focused on physical and communal strength. He rallied the people to rebuild Jerusalem's walls, organizing them section by section until the city once again had defenses, a tangible sign that the community was not only restored but secure. Yet restoration came with tension. Neighboring groups, including Samaritans, descendants of those who had remained in the land and intermarried with settlers, offered to join in rebuilding, but were rejected, deepening divisions that would endure for centuries. The returnees, determined to preserve purity of worship and identity, sometimes clashed with those who had never left. Unity was fragile, contested as much as the stones of the city. Still, amid hardship, something remarkable took shape. The people, now fewer in number and weaker in power than their neighbors, carried within them a resilience honed by exile. They were no longer defined solely by kings or borders, but by covenant and law, by the rhythms of Scripture and the memory of survival. The rebuilt temple, humbler than Solomon's, became no less sacred, for it symbolized continuity, the proof that a people scattered by empire could endure and return, carrying their faith like a torch through the darkness. The return was not a golden age. It was fragile, contested, incomplete. But it was also a beginning. In the rebuilding of temple and walls, in the renewal of covenant and law, the people of Judah discovered anew that survival was not about strength of armies or grandeur of kings, but about the enduring power of faith, memory, and identity. Legacy of Canaan and Israel. Canaan began as a narrow strip of contested land, a corridor between empires, a crossroads of trade and conflict. Yet from its hills and valleys rose a story that would outlast the pharaohs of Egypt and the kings of Mesopotamia. The tale of its peoples, Canaanites, Israelites, and Judahites, was one of rise and fall, of exile and return of faith forged in the crucible of history. The geography that once made Canaan vulnerable also made it extraordinary. Armies trampled its plains, merchants filled its markets, and pilgrims carried its ideas far beyond its borders. No empire could ignore it, yet no empire could hold it forever. Each left its mark, but none silenced the voices that called this land home. In its soil, civilizations clashed. In its stones, new identities took form. The Israelites emerged not as conquerors at first, but as highland villagers, shaping community in the shadow of greater powers. From scattered settlements came unity, from unity came kings, and from kings came the dream of empire. Saul's fragile beginnings, David's charisma and conquest, Solomon's splendor, all carved their names into the land. Yet as quickly as the dream of unity rose, it fractured, split by ambition, rivalry, and resentment into two kingdoms destined for divergent fates. Israel in the north dazzled with wealth and power, but its brilliance was short-lived, extinguished by Assyrian conquest. Judah endured longer, clinging to its temple, its dynasty, and its stubborn faith. Yet even Judah fell, consumed by Babylon's fury, its people dragged into exile, its holy city reduced to ash. By all accounts, it should have ended there. And yet it did not. Out of exile came resilience. Stripped of kings and temple, the people carried their covenant in memory, song, and text. Prophets reframed disaster as discipline, lament as hope. In Babylon, traditions deepened, scriptures took shape, and identity became portable, unbreakable. When the Persians allowed their return, what came back to Jerusalem was not the same people who had left it, was a people transformed, bound together by faith more than territory, by covenant more than crown. This legacy stretched far beyond Canaan's ridges. The theological innovations born in its hills and refined in exile would ripple across millennia, shaping Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The prophets' cries for justice, the Psalms' songs of lament and praise, the covenant's vision of a people bound to their God, all became universal touchstones for countless generations, seeking meaning in suffering and purpose in endurance. Canaan was never the largest, nor the richest, nor the most secure of lands. Yet it was here, in this narrow corridor of stone and soil, that humanity's spiritual imagination was forever transformed. Its legacy is not monuments of stone, for most have crumbled, nor empires of conquest, for all have fallen. Its true legacy is the endurance of a story, the story of a people who rose from obscurity, endured exile, and carried their faith into the future, lighting the path for civilizations yet to come, between empire and identity. The people who returned from exile did not return to sovereignty, they returned to a land still under empire. First Persia, then Greece, and later Rome would rule the land once called Canaan. Yet under each foreign power, the community preserved what exile had taught them, that survival lay not in armies or palaces, but in faith and identity. Life under Persia brought relative tolerance. Governors oversaw the land, but the temple stood the priesthood led, and the covenant people continued to define themselves through law and worship. The Sabbath became more than rest, it was a declaration of identity, a marker that no empire could erase. Festivals retold their story of deliverance, reminding them year after year that even when nations fell, their God remained. Under Greece, the challenge sharpened. Alexander's conquests swept through, bringing new ideas, languages, and customs. Hellenistic rulers encouraged adoption of Greek ways, gymnasiums, theatres, idols in marble. Some welcomed this blending, others resisted fiercely. The books of Maccabees record a fiery struggle in which faith and identity clashed with cultural assimilation, leading to rebellion and the rededication of the temple. Through it all, the community grew ever more defined by law, memory, and sacred text. Kings no longer ruled them, but scriptures guided them. Empires came and went, but their identity endured, sharpened by the tension of living as both subject people and chosen people. The land that had been crossroads of empires became for them a testing ground, where the covenant was lived out not in glory, but in persistence. Echoes through time. The story of Canaan and Israel did not end with exile or return, it became a thread woven through the fabric of human history. The Psalms, once sung on hillsides and in exile, echoed in synagogues, churches, and mosques. The prophets' cries for justice inspired reformers and dreamers across the centuries. The covenant, forged in the highlands, carried a vision of relationship between the divine and humanity that shaped the conscience of civilizations. Even when empires like Rome destroyed Jerusalem's temple, once more scattering the people across the world, the story endured. In synagogues of the diaspora, in the chants of early Christians, in the recitations of the Quran, the memory of Canaan lived on. The exile became a metaphor for every people displaced, the return a hope for restoration, the covenant a promise that suffering could give birth to renewal. The legacy is not merely historical, it is timeless. It reminds us that greatness is not measured by wealth or walls, but by endurance. That even in ruins, faith can be rebuilt. That even in exile, identity can survive. And that a small land nestled between rivers and deserts could give birth to ideas vast enough to reshape the world. From the terraces of the highlands to the ruins of Jerusalem, from Babylon's rivers to distant shores where exiles settled, the echoes continue. The story of Canaan and Israel is not finished. It still whispers to those who seek meaning in hardship, who search for hope in exile, who believe that from brokenness renewal can come.